Right now, someone is reading a message that looks completely normal. It came from what appears to be their bank, or maybe Amazon or the IRS. The logo is right, the colors are right. The tone is professional, urgent, but not alarming. The kind of message you've seen 100 times before. And that's exactly the problem. Because the message isn't from any of those places. It never was. And by the time the person reading it figures that out, if they ever do, something irreversible will have already happened. This is not a story about a scam that targeted the elderly, the vulnerable, or the technologically illiterate. This is a story about a system, carefully engineered, psychologically precise, and operating at a scale that most people never see, that is actively targeting people exactly like you. People with jobs, bank accounts, smartphones, and email inboxes. People who consider themselves careful. People who would swear before it happened to them that they would never fall for something like this. The people running this system aren't amateurs. They're not working out of a basement with cheap software and broken English. They have tools. They have infrastructure. They have data, your data, and they know how to use it. They've studied human psychology the same way a surgeon studies anatomy. Not out of curiosity, but because precision is everything. And what they've discovered is something deeply unsettling. The most effective way to manipulate someone isn't to frighten them. It isn't to confuse them. It's to make everything look exactly the way it's supposed to look. What you're about to see isn't a warning about the future. It's a documentation of something that is happening right now. In your country, in your city, possibly in your own inbox. And the reason most people never catch it is the same reason it works so well. It looks like something you've seen before. To understand how this works, you need to understand what we're actually dealing with. Because when most people think about online fraud, they imagine something that feels foreign. A stranger on the other end. A poorly worded email with a strange attachment. Something that triggers a warning signal before any damage is done. That model is obsolete. What's happening now is categorically different, not just in scale, but in design. The new architecture of digital fraud is built on one foundational principle. The most dangerous threat is the one that doesn't look like a threat at all. And that principle has been engineered into every layer of how these operations function. We're talking about organizations, because calling them anything less would be inaccurate, that operate with the sophistication of a mid-sized technology company. They have division of labor, they have quality control. They test their materials the same way a marketing agency tests campaign copy, against real users in real conditions, measuring real response rates. They iterate, they optimize. They learn from failure, and they are extraordinarily good at what they do. The FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, known as the IC3, reported losses exceeding $12 billion from cybercrime in a single recent year. $12 billion. That number represents only the cases that were reported, which researchers consistently estimate at somewhere between 10 and 15% of actual incidents. The real figure is staggering, and unlike the dramatic cybercrime stories that make headlines, the ransomware attacks on hospitals, the state-sponsored breaches of government networks, the bulk of that 12 billion came from something quieter, more personal, and far more common. It came from people who clicked on a link that looked real, who called a number that looked official, who entered their information into a page that looked identical to the one they use every single day. This is what's known in the security industry as phishing, a term that has become so familiar it has almost lost its meaning. People hear the word and think they understand it. They think they know what to look for. They've been trained, they believe, to spot the signs. But here's what those people don't know. Here's the part that changes everything. The technique they are picturing, the clumsy, obvious, grammatically broken fraud attempt, is largely dead. What replaced it is something that operates on an entirely different level of sophistication. And the gap between what most people expect and what's actually out there is exactly the gap these operations exploit. Consider what happened to a woman we'll call Rachel. Rachel is 43 years old. She lives in the suburbs of Atlanta. She works in healthcare administration, a field that requires attention to detail, careful documentation, and constant digital communication. She manages a team. She handles sensitive data. She has, in her professional life, sat through more than one cybersecurity training session. She knows, in the general sense that most people know, that scams exist and that she should be careful. On a Tuesday morning in March, Rachel received an email from what appeared to be her bank. The email looked perfect. Not approximately right. Perfect. The logo was the correct size, the correct color, the correct font. The header design matched the bank's actual communications. The footer contained the accurate address, the accurate phone number, a legitimate-looking legal disclaimer, and an unsubscribe link. The subject line read, "Action required. Unusual activity detected on your account." Rachel had received emails like this before, from her actual bank when she'd traveled out of state and triggered a fraud alert. She knew what this kind of communication looked like, and what she was looking at looked exactly like that. The email explained that her account had been temporarily restricted due to suspicious login activity originating from an unrecognized device. She needed to verify her identity within 24 hours to restore full access. A button in the center of the email read, "Verify my account." She hesitated for a moment, not because anything looked wrong, but because she was in the middle of something else, and she wanted to finish it first. She came back to the email 40 minutes later. She clicked the button. The page that loaded was her bank's website, or at least it was indistinguishable from her bank's website. The URL in the browser bar was not her bank's actual address, but it was close enough that a person scanning it quickly, which is how almost everyone reads a URL, would not notice the difference. One letter had been transposed. One character was different. The rest was identical. She entered her username. She entered her password. The page asked her to confirm her identity using her debit card number and the 3-digit security code on the back. She entered those too. The page then displayed a message. Your account has been successfully verified. You may experience a brief delay while our security team reviews your account activity. Thank you for your patience. Rachel closed the browser and went back to her work. She didn't think about it again until the following morning, when she received an alert from her real bank. An actual alert this time, through the bank's actual app, notifying her that her debit card had been used in 3 transactions overnight. 2 in Phoenix, 1 in Miami. She had not been to either city. By the time she called her bank, the balance in her checking account had dropped by just over $4,000. Now, here's where most investigations stop. They document what happened, they explain that Rachel was deceived, and they tell you to be careful about clicking links in emails. Be skeptical, verify sources. Don't enter your information on unfamiliar sites. That's the surface. That's the layer that most content stays on. And if that were all there was to this, Rachel's story would be unfortunate but simple. But what actually happened? What was actually operating behind that email, that button, that page, is something far more complex. And understanding it is the only way to truly understand the scale of what we're dealing with. Because Rachel wasn't targeted randomly. The email she received wasn't sent to 1 million people in a mass blast hoping someone would bite. That approach still exists, but it's the low end of the market. The commodity fraud that catches a small percentage of a very large net. What happened to Rachel was something more deliberate. In the weeks before that Tuesday morning, data about Rachel had been moving through channels she knew nothing about. Her email address had appeared in at least 2 separate data breaches. One from a retail loyalty program, one from a fitness tracking app she'd downloaded 3 years earlier and forgotten about. Those breaches didn't attract major headlines. They were the kind of incidents that get disclosed quietly, months after the fact, in legal notices that most people never read. But somewhere, someone was reading them. The email address she used, the bank she was listed with, inferable from the credit data included in one breach, her general location derived from the ZIP code attached to her loyalty account, her likely age range and income bracket, inferable from the combination of purchases, the type of credit card on file, and the specific retailer. This information was aggregated, cross-referenced, and packaged. It was sold, not on the dark web, though the dark web is certainly part of this ecosystem, but through a layered economy of stolen and semi-stolen data that operates with surprising efficiency. By the time the email hit Rachel's inbox, the people who sent it knew which bank to impersonate, because they had enough context to make a calculated bet that it was her bank. They were right. And the email itself didn't come from someone typing it out manually. It came from a platform, a piece of software specifically designed to generate phishing communications at scale with customizable templates, automated sending infrastructure, and built-in evasion tools designed to slip past spam filters. These platforms exist. They're sold. Some are even advertised in certain corners of the internet with customer support and feature updates because the people building them understand that their users have options and need to be retained. The page Rachel landed on, the fake bank website, was created using a cloning tool that can reproduce a legitimate website in minutes. Not hours, minutes. The tool captures the visual structure, the CSS, the images, the layout, and reconstructs it in a form that accepts input and forwards it to whoever is collecting the data. The slight difference in the URL, the one transposed letter, is not an oversight. It's a calculated decision. A URL that's too similar to the real thing can trigger automated security warnings. A URL that's different by exactly one character in a non-obvious position is designed to pass machine checks while still passing human ones. Everything about what Rachel experienced was engineered. The timing of the email, mid-morning on a weekday when people are alert but distracted. The subject line, urgent but not panicked, because panic creates friction. The 24-hour window, enough pressure to motivate action, not so much that it triggers doubt. The verification page, requesting just enough information to be useful, not so much that it feels excessive. This is not improvisation, this is design. But even that isn't the whole picture, because the operation that targeted Rachel didn't end when she submitted her information. The data she entered, her credentials, her card number, her security code, was captured in real time. Within minutes of her submitting the form, automated systems were already testing her banking credentials against the actual bank's login portal. This is known as credential stuffing, using stolen username and password combinations against live systems to identify which ones still work. The process is automated. It can run through thousands of combinations per hour. Rachel's credentials worked. They always work because the people running these systems don't move until they know something will open a door. Once inside her account, the operation moved quickly, not recklessly, quickly and carefully. They didn't immediately drain the account. That would trigger fraud alerts too fast. Instead, automated tools scanned the account. Balance, transaction history, linked accounts, payment methods, scheduled transfers. Everything was mapped in seconds. Then the transactions began. Not in one large withdrawal, but in a pattern. Multiple smaller transactions, timed and sized to stay just below the thresholds that typically trigger automatic fraud alerts. 2 transactions in Phoenix, 1 in Miami, because those cities have high volumes of legitimate financial activity, which makes the transactions harder to flag as anomalous. By the time Rachel's bank detected the pattern, the following morning, through their own fraud monitoring systems, $4,000 had moved out of her account and into payment networks that were already several steps removed from their origin. The money moved through a chain of accounts, some of them belonging to unwitting individuals who had themselves been victimized. People recruited to act as money mules, often through fake job postings that described the work as payment processing or financial coordination. By the time investigators could trace the chain, the money had been converted. Cryptocurrency, gift cards, wire transfers to accounts in jurisdictions where cooperation with U.S. law enforcement is limited. The practical likelihood of recovery was close to zero. Rachel spent the next 2 weeks on the phone with her bank, with the fraud department, with her state's attorney general's office. She filed an IC3 report. She spent hours documenting the transaction history, the email, the page she'd visited, everything she could remember. Her bank recovered a portion of the funds, at about half, through their own fraud insurance processes, after a dispute that took 6 weeks to resolve. The rest was gone. And the operation that targeted her? It didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. This is the part that most people never fully reckon with: the scale. We have been talking about Rachel's story as though it were an individual event, a crime with a beginning, a middle, and an end. One victim, one perpetrator, one outcome. But what actually happened to Rachel was a single output from a system that, on that same Tuesday morning, generated thousands of identical events across the country. Different names, different banks, different amounts, the same architecture. These operations are not boutique criminal enterprises. They are not small teams of clever hackers running targeted schemes. The infrastructure that exists to support this kind of fraud is, by any reasonable measure, an industry. It has supply chains. It has specialization. There are people whose sole function is to maintain phishing platforms. There are people whose sole function is to acquire and package data. There are people whose sole function is to recruit money mules. There are people whose sole function is to launder the proceeds. Each layer operates with a degree of separation from the others. The person who sent Rachel's email may never have known her name or cared about it. They were moving product, running a campaign, measuring click rates and conversion rates, the same metrics a legitimate email marketing company would track. The geographic reach of these operations is extensive. Significant infrastructure has been identified in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, West Africa, and South America. But identified is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because identification does not equal prosecution, and prosecution does not equal conviction, and conviction does not equal disruption of the underlying operation. Law enforcement agencies across multiple continents are working this problem, and they are making progress. But the economics are brutally asymmetric. The cost of running a phishing campaign is measured in hundreds of dollars. The potential return is measured in tens of thousands. The probability of prosecution for anyone but the lowest level operators remains vanishingly small. This is why it continues. Not because law enforcement isn't trying, not because the banks aren't aware, not because the technology doesn't exist to detect and block much of this activity. It continues because the system is designed to exist in the gaps, in the space between what security tools can detect and what human perception notices, in the lag between when a new phishing template is deployed and when it gets flagged, in the moment of distraction, the 40 minutes Rachel spent on something else before coming back to the email. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called the illusion of explanatory depth. It describes the gap between how well people think they understand something and how well they actually understand it. Ask someone if they know how a toilet works, and most people will say yes. Ask them to explain it in detail, and most people will quickly discover that they can describe the general idea, water goes in, water goes out, without actually understanding the mechanism. The same principle applies to digital fraud. Ask most people if they know what a phishing email looks like, and they'll say yes. They've been told to look for bad grammar, suspicious attachments, strange senders, urgent requests for personal information. They know the checklist. But the checklist was written for a version of phishing that no longer represents the top of the market. The checklist catches the commodity fraud, the low-effort campaigns that sweep wide and convert a small fraction. It doesn't catch what we've been describing here. It doesn't catch an email that's grammatically perfect, visually flawless, contextually appropriate, and psychologically calibrated to the specific situation of its recipient. And here's the mechanism behind that gap. The piece that explains not just how Rachel fell for it, but why almost anyone would. The human brain is not designed for the kind of vigilance that modern digital fraud requires. It is designed for pattern recognition, energy efficiency, and rapid decision-making. When something matches a familiar pattern, when an email looks like the emails you've received from your bank 100 times before, the brain does not want to slow down and verify each element. Slowing down and verifying has a cognitive cost. Pattern matching is fast and cheap. This is what behavioral scientists call System 1 processing. It's the rapid, intuitive, automatic mode that handles most of what we do throughout the day. It's not a flaw. It's an adaptation. It allows us to function without constant exhaustion. But it is a vulnerability. The designers of sophisticated phishing infrastructure understand this, even if they've never read a behavioral economics textbook. They understand it empirically because they test their materials against real people and measure what works. And what works consistently and reliably is material that matches the pattern so closely that System 1 accepts it without ever escalating to System 2. The slower, more deliberate analytical mode that might catch the discrepancy. The slightly wrong URL is invisible to System 1 because System 1 isn't reading the URL character by character. It's pattern matching against the general shape of a URL that looks right. The urgency in the subject line activates a low-level threat response that subtly pressures the brain toward action over reflection. The professional visual design signals legitimacy before a single word has been read, Because the brain processes visual trustworthiness faster than it processes language. Everything is calibrated to keep System 1 in charge and System 2 quiet. And now we get to the part of this that should change something. Not just how you think about your inbox, but how you think about the entire ecosystem of digital trust. Because what we've been describing, the cloned websites, the crafted emails, the data pipelines, the psychological calibration, none of it would be as effective as it is if not for a series of structural failures that go far beyond any individual criminal's cleverness. Consider the data that made Rachel targetable in the first place. That data existed because two companies, a retailer and a fitness app, stored her personal information in systems that were eventually breached. Those breaches happened despite the existence of data security regulations, despite industry standards, despite the fact that both companies almost certainly had IT security policies in place. The systems failed. The data escaped. And here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. When that data entered the criminal ecosystem, there was no mechanism to get it back. There's no recall for stolen personal data. Once your email address, your name, your location, and your financial context have been scraped, packaged, and sold, they exist in that ecosystem indefinitely. They get bought and sold and rebundled and resold. They get combined with data from other breaches to build increasingly complete profiles. The breach that happened 3 years ago is still generating operational value for fraud campaigns today. Meanwhile, the companies that experienced those breaches faced, in most cases, consequences that were modest relative to the harm they enabled. A regulatory fine, perhaps. A lawsuit that settled for a fraction of what the affected individuals lost. A news cycle that lasted a week. The structural incentive to invest heavily in data security is, for many companies, weaker than the structural incentive to minimize cost. This isn't speculation. It's a pattern that shows up consistently across the history of data breach incidents. And then there's the infrastructure problem. The domains used to host phishing pages can be registered, in many cases in under an hour for a few dollars. The email infrastructure used to send phishing campaigns can be spun up with minimal friction. The payment processing channels that move stolen money out of victim accounts operate with enough speed and enough jurisdictional complexity that intervention, when it comes, almost always comes too late. The financial industry has invested heavily in fraud detection, and it works. It caught Rachel's transactions. But it caught them the morning after they happened, not while they were happening, and certainly not before. The detection systems are reactive by design because real-time blocking of every transaction that matches a fraud pattern would generate enormous false positives and create friction for legitimate customers. This is the ecosystem in which these operations exist, not an environment that's hostile to them, an environment that is, in many ways, structurally accommodating. Here's something that doesn't get discussed enough because it complicates the story in ways that are uncomfortable. The people who fall for sophisticated phishing, people like Rachel, are not failing to apply knowledge they have. They are being actively outmaneuvered by systems that have studied their decision-making and designed for it. The framing of "you should have known better" misses the mechanism entirely. Security researchers who study this professionally, people who spend their careers analyzing phishing infrastructure, have published studies showing that even among trained IT professionals, well-crafted phishing emails achieve click rates that are meaningfully higher than zero. Not because these professionals are careless, because the materials are designed to succeed against people who are trying to be careful. There was a famous study conducted a few years ago in which a security firm sent a simulated phishing email, crafted to a high standard, to the employees of a major organization. The email referenced a real benefit offered by the company and was visually consistent with authentic communications from HR. The click rate was over 40% among employees who had received phishing awareness training in the previous 6 months. 40%. This is what we're actually dealing with, not a problem that can be solved by telling people to be more careful. A problem that requires understanding the full architecture of what's being deployed against ordinary people on a daily basis. So let's get specific about what that architecture looks like today. Because the field has evolved, and the current state is more sophisticated than most public discussions acknowledge. The generation of fraudulent communications has increasingly incorporated large language model technology, the same underlying technology that powers the AI tools millions of people use for legitimate purposes. The implications of this are significant. One of the most reliable signals of a fraudulent email has historically been language quality. Poor grammar, awkward phrasing, constructions that feel slightly off even if nothing is explicitly wrong. These signals existed because phishing operations often worked across language barriers with materials created by people who weren't native English speakers. That signal is becoming unreliable. AI-generated text can produce fluent, contextually appropriate, grammatically perfect English at essentially zero marginal cost. It can be prompted to match the tone and style of a specific institution's communications. It can be used to personalize, to incorporate details about the recipient that make the communication feel less like a broadcast and more like a direct message. The cloning of legitimate websites, the technique used to create the fake bank page Rachel visited, has also become dramatically easier. Tools exist that can reproduce a target website with near-perfect fidelity in a matter of minutes. Some of these tools are marketed as legitimate web development utilities. They have other uses, but they are also used for this. The URL problem, the one letter transposed in Rachel's case, is being addressed in an interesting way. Increasingly sophisticated operations are using what are called IDN homograph attacks, domain names that use characters from non-Latin alphabets that are visually indistinguishable from Latin characters. The letter that looks like an A might be a Cyrillic A. They look identical in most browser displays. The domain resolves differently. The URL bar shows something that appears to be exact. Not almost right, but exact. Multi-factor authentication has been widely promoted as a defense against credential theft, and it is, to a degree. But sophisticated operations have adapted. Real-time phishing proxies, tools that sit between the victim and the legitimate website, can intercept and relay authentication codes in the seconds between when they're generated and when they expire. The victim enters a code that appears to be completing a verification process. The code is simultaneously being used by the attacker to authenticate to the real site. This is not theoretical. This is documented. It's been observed in operation. The sophistication curve is real, and it's moving in one direction. Let's talk about something that almost never gets discussed in the mainstream coverage of these topics: the psychological experience of the victim after the fact. Because the financial loss, devastating as it can be, is often not the only consequence. Rachel described the weeks following her incident in terms that security researchers and victim advocates have heard before. The pervasive feeling of having been fooled, not robbed at gunpoint, not hacked by some force beyond human agency, but tricked. Deceived. The internal narrative that forms is almost always some version of, "I should have known. Why didn't I catch it? What's wrong with me?" That narrative is wrong, as we've discussed, but it's persistent, and it has effects. People who've experienced this kind of fraud often become, over time, either hypervigilant or numbed to security alerts, neither of which is the optimal state. Hypervigilance creates friction that makes it hard to function normally in a digital environment. Numbness is self-explanatory in its dangers. There's also a social dimension that doesn't get enough attention. Many victims don't report what happened to them, not to law enforcement, not to family, not to friends. Because reporting requires telling someone that you fell for it. And the shame associated with that disclosure is real, documented, and counterproductive. Every incident that goes unreported is a data point that doesn't enter the system, a pattern that doesn't get identified, a signal that gets lost. The IC3's own materials acknowledge this. The $12 billion figure that gets cited comes with the asterisk that it represents only reported cases. The real total, by most estimates, is several multiples larger. Now we need to talk about some things that are actually useful to know, not a checklist, not a simplified 5 tips to stay safe online. Something more honest than that, a framework for understanding what you're actually dealing with and what meaningful countermeasures look like. The first thing to understand is that the goal is not to achieve perfect security. Perfect security in the current environment is not achievable. The goal is to add friction, to slow down the decision-making process at the moments that matter, and to make the cost of a successful attack against you higher than it is against the next person. Attackers, like all rational actors, optimize for efficiency. Higher friction targets get less attention. Friction, in practical terms, means introducing deliberate delays and verification steps at specific trigger points. The trigger points that matter most are the ones that involve financial action, credential entry, or the sharing of sensitive information. When something, any channel, any format, creates a path that leads to those actions, that's the moment to slow down. The specific behaviors that consistently function as attack vectors are worth understanding in concrete terms. Urgency is almost always artificial. Legitimate institutions have processes. Those processes include time. A bank that has actually frozen your account will still have that account frozen in 2 hours or tomorrow morning, when you've had time to call the number on the back of your card to verify. The 24-hour countdown in Rachel's email was designed to prevent her from doing exactly that. Artificial urgency is one of the most reliable signals of manipulation, precisely because it's designed to be invisible as urgency and visible only as importance. The path of action matters as much as the destination. When a communication asks you to take an action, click a link, call a number, download an attachment, the safest response is to independently navigate to the source. Not through the link provided, not through the number given, through a channel you've used before and verified independently. Your bank's app, a phone number you've dialed previously, the official website typed manually into a fresh browser tab. This single habit, refusing to travel the path offered to you and instead finding your own, disrupts a significant portion of current phishing technique, because the entire architecture depends on controlling where you go. URLs require more than a glance. The character-by-character reading of a URL is unnatural and cognitively uncomfortable, which is exactly why it's necessary for the specific moment when you're about to enter sensitive information. The domain, the section immediately before the first single / after the HTTPS, A, is the part that matters most. Everything before that domain is potentially decorator. Looking at the domain itself, carefully, character by character, takes about 3 seconds. It's one of the highest return investments of cognitive effort available in this context. Two-factor authentication, even though we've discussed its limitations against the most sophisticated attacks, still provides meaningful protection against a very large portion of the threat landscape. The attacks that can defeat real-time 2FA are resource-intensive and typically reserved for higher-value targets. For most people, enabling 2FA on financial accounts and email significantly raises the cost of a successful attack. Do it. The inconvenience is real but small. The protection is meaningful. Data minimization, the practice of not providing more personal information than strictly necessary, and periodically reviewing what accounts and services hold your data, reduces your footprint in breach ecosystems. Every account that holds your data is a potential source of the kind of profile that made Rachel targetable. Some of those accounts are necessary, many of them are not. But here's where we have to return to something uncomfortable, because everything we've just described, the individual behaviors, the personal habits, the friction-adding practices, they help. They genuinely help. But they don't address the structural problem, and the structural problem is not going away on the strength of individual vigilance. The data economy that made Rachel's targeting possible is still largely intact. The regulatory frameworks governing data security are inconsistent, enforcement is uneven, and the penalties for failures that enable mass consumer harm remain, in most jurisdictions, substantially below what would be required to create a genuine market incentive for prevention. The infrastructure, the domains, the hosting, the payment channels that supports phishing operations can be disrupted at the technical level, and there are active efforts to do this. But the economics favor reconstruction. A disrupted campaign can be rebuilt faster than it can be taken down. The asymmetry is structural. Law enforcement progress against the highest levels of these organizations is real but slow, constrained by jurisdiction, by resource limitations, and by the operational security sophistication of the organizations themselves. Major busts happen, arrests are made, and other operations continue, and new ones emerge because the fundamental supply and demand relationship hasn't changed. What this means is that the responsibility currently sitting on individual users to be constantly vigilant, constantly skeptical, constantly checking, is a burden that is being asked of ordinary people to compensate for systemic failures that operate several levels above any individual's ability to address them. That is not a comfortable truth. It doesn't translate easily into actionable steps, but it matters because the framing of this as primarily an individual problem, something that happens when people aren't careful enough, actively obscures the structural dimensions that would need to change for the situation to meaningfully improve. There's one more element to examine before we close, and it's possibly the most unsettling part of what we've covered. The techniques we've described in detail, the cloned websites, the calibrated urgency, the psychological exploitation of pattern recognition, are not limited to email. They are not even primarily email-based anymore, though email remains a major vector. Text messages, SMS, and messaging apps have become a primary attack surface. The phenomenon has a name in the security industry: smishing. The mechanics are the same. The reach is different. People apply less skepticism to text messages than to emails. The visual context of a text, the small screen, the conversational format, makes detailed examination of links feel unnatural in a way that emailed examination, with its larger display and established security culture, does not. Voice calls and phishing have evolved significantly with the integration of AI-generated voice synthesis, the technology that allows the real-time generation of a voice that sounds like a specific person, a specific institution's customer service representative, a government official, even, in some documented cases, a known individual, is mature enough to be deployed at scale. Calls that sound like your bank with background audio that sounds like a call center, conducted by a voice that sounds indistinguishably professional, are not hypothetical. They are documented. They are in operation. QR codes, the square matrix barcodes that became ubiquitous during the pandemic years and have remained embedded in consumer behavior, have opened a new channel. A QR code in a physical location, on a parking meter, on a restaurant table, in a piece of physical mail, on a poster. The URL it resolves to is not visible until after it's been accessed. The physical presence of the code implies legitimacy in a way that a digital link does not. And yet the destination can be a phishing page, identical to every other phishing page we've described. The attack surface is expanding. The techniques are generalizing across channels, and the psychological principles remain constant. Match the pattern, reduce friction toward the target action, add just enough urgency to overcome hesitation. Rachel's story has a partial resolution. Half the money came back eventually. She changed her passwords, all of them. She enabled two-factor authentication on every account that offered it. She now takes a moment every time she receives any communication that leads to any kind of action to stop and verify through an independent channel before proceeding. She says she doesn't feel safer. She feels more aware. And she says that awareness, though it's valuable, also comes with a cost, a persistent low-level alertness, a second guessing of things that used to feel automatic, a knowledge that the environment she moves through every day contains threats that are designed specifically to be invisible to her. That's not paranoia. That's an accurate read of the situation. The system that targeted Rachel is still operating. The infrastructure that delivered her email cloned the page, captured her data, and moved her money through a chain of accounts designed to be untraceable. That infrastructure is still running. It targeted other people that same Tuesday morning. It's targeting people right now, today, at the moment you're hearing this. And the most important thing to understand about it isn't the technical mechanism. The technical mechanism is almost secondary. The most important thing to understand is that it works not by defeating your security knowledge, but by never appearing to require it. It looks like something you've already seen. It looks like something that's already resolved. It looks like nothing happened, until it does. The question that this investigation leaves open, the one that doesn't have a clean answer, isn't whether this will keep happening. It will. It's whether the systems we've built to handle digital trust are structurally capable of closing the gap before the sophistication of the threat exceeds the capacity of individual vigilance to compensate. Because right now, that gap is widening. And most people still have no idea it exists.